Thank you, everyone, for being here at our second panel of the conference, translating across, amid, between, a conversation. I'm David Larson, a professor at NYU Liberal Studies, here to moderate the panel, which will begin with Jennifer Hayashida, whose information is here before you. We agreed that we would involve biographies either. And then Mitra Rastragar will go second with the title Between Feminism and Anti-Imperialism, Iranian Diaspora Feminists Translating the Jina Revolution. And then third, Natalie. Close out the presentations with her remarks, and then we'll have lots of conversation. And my role will really to be have as light a touch as possible. I would like to begin with a sort of a decentering exercise that may not be completely obvious when I begin by saying that I was in a cathedral a month ago, where I had an experience, first time, where I'd heard the word used by a tour guide. I overheard it. I heard the word translate used in its etymological sense, which is where the bones of a saint are removed from one crypt and then carried out of the building and then reinterred in another crypt. And this is where the word translation comes from, the actual. And it was a pagan custom too, where you would take saintly relics from one temple and carry them in to the other. And I was really struck then, as I am now, how that doesn't really cover the lived experience of translation as we wrestle with it. And I think my panelists might agree that the ritual I just described, it's a solemn, ceremonial process within a church institution, you know, a very male, masculinist. Yes, the church is the bride of Christ, but it's still, you know, all run by men doing it. And that it's, above all, it's not in response to crisis, as I understand. I should look more into the real process of translation of sacred relics. But the point is, translation is, as we know, it's done on the run. It's done in situations of terrible crisis. You know, when we think of it as a literary art, yes, that's something done in retirement and leisure and on research fellowships, but that's not what our panel is here to discuss. We're really going to be working and hearing about translation, as I say, lived experience, and as survival mechanism, and as mechanism that does not always work as it should, or, I mean, so that's my best attempt to bring the session to order. And Jennifer, we'd love you to begin. Thank you, everyone.
So thank you, David, and thank you to Montana and Jen for inviting me, and thank you to everybody here for making this an incredible event. I have to say, I'm still kind of stunned at being here, and I don't know if I'll stop being stunned until I get back to the airport in Stockholm, which will very easily take away any awe you have felt during your travels. Thank you for laughing at my one joke, Eugene. So these are my parents, Ross and Karen. I like to begin with a sort of ethics of disclosure in terms of how I came into my languages or how they came into me. My father, to your left, was third generation Japanese American, grew up in Honolulu. He spoke standard American English, Pidgin, what my grandmother referred to as country Japanese. And my mother, to the right, is a first-generation immigrant from Sweden. She speaks, at the time when they met in 65. My mom came to the US as an au pair, met my dad, who was a drummer in a band. They had me. But she spoke very little English when she got to the US. She had been outside Sweden once to the Canary Islands. And so her English is very American, nearly fluent at this point. And they were the ones who raised me and taught me how to speak and how to translate. So I have a mother tongue and a father tongue. I don't love those terms for obvious reasons, but because they also sort of, the terms represent the loyalties that I have in the different languages. Swedish was very much to me growing up the language I spoke with my mother, which was a language of a kind of loyalty against my father. American English, on the other hand, was the language of books, a kind of multilingualism. Going back to what you were saying earlier, there were many Englishes. There was one Swedish, but there were many Englishes that I had access to. And so American English was also a language where I had greater sort of freedom of movement. It's important to me that we sort of talk about how we came into the languages that we work in, because it's very easy to think that we just one day have fluency, which is an obvious sort of privilege to be able to speak a language fluently. I'm going to be humming a lot, not musically, but because I can't see my presentation mode, so I'm going to be looking at my sort of weird notes. So I'm born in the US. When I was 5, my mom and I moved back to Sweden. I'm the only child. I grew up speaking Swedish there with her and English with my dad. When I was 16, she and I moved back to the United States, and I basically stayed in the United States more or less continuously until 2018. So most of my high school and university education took place in the United States, which is also when I became sort of fluent in academic American English as well. So that was like the additional sort of English that became available to me at that point. During my childhood, so this is the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, or 80s and 90s, I didn't really think about how I could feel when I was in Sweden with my mother that the way my language, one of my languages, Swedish, was perceived by others was as a mismatch. My body was not supposed to be the one speaking Swedish. It's a white language. At the time, Sweden was an incredibly racially homogenous country. Less so now, which I will talk about later. But there was always this sense that people were startled, that Swedish words would come out of my mouth fluently. When I moved to the United States, I sort of naively thought that that would change. But of course, I was still racialized as Asian, and as many scholars have sort of pointed out, there's an inherent foreignness to that. But in terms of translation studies, there's also an inherent expectation that you're supposed to speak an Asian language, which has also sort of informed the translation work that I've gone on to do. And so when I would be in different sort of translation contexts at festivals or readings or whatever, there was always an assumption that I translated from the Japanese. I don't speak a single word of Japanese, and then I always feel sort of sheepish saying that, which is so, like I'm doing this right now, as if it's like a failure on my part. But in any event, so I was aware of what I've now come to understand as like an actual field of linguistics around how race and bodies are sort of linked to each other, or race and language are linked to bodies. But it was a feeling that I had, and it was a feeling of otherness that transcended the otherness that I experienced as someone who was racialized as sort of Asian adoptee in Sweden and sort of mysteriously Asian in the United States. I wrote a text in 2020 where I realized that I needed to actually take a position on the sort of autotheoretical nature of my understanding of translation, how my own sort of body and experience is enacted. And so I'm just going to read a little bit of it. It's a multilingual, not translingual, but multilingual text that I wrote for a chapbook in Sweden. In the practice of translation, the translator's biography is in play, activated, on alert. The translator's bodily knowledge is mobilized, her experience of unsolicited hands and eyes, her conditioning by surveillance, blows, or borders, her racialized and gendered body. Then go back even further to the inheritance of translation, echoes lost in and outside the womb. As poet and translator Dawn Miche writes in her 2016 keynote address to the American Literary Translators Association, later published as the essay, Translation as a Mode, Translation as an Anti-Neocolonial Mode. Quote, I was already born with a tongue with a task to translate, but motherless and expelled from power. Or Tam Lum, the protagonist in Frank Chin's 1972 play, The Chicken Coop Chinaman, quote, I am the natural-born ragmouth, speaking the motherless bloody tongue, unquote. Translator, I wonder what brings you to translation and if I should be suspicious of your motives. Does your method belong to a history of settlerism and silencing? Whose motherless bloody tongue do you attempt to speak? So then I became a translator. I did my MFA at Bard, which was an interdisciplinary MFA program. And I had completed my undergraduate degree. I had moved to New York. It was the realization of a lifelong dream. I thought of it as a sort of hyperlingual or like a place where language wouldn't matter. I don't know why I thought that. The second year of my MFA program, my dad died. He had been sick for a really long time, and so it was still unexpected, and in that process, I couldn't write anything. It's a low residency program, and you're supposed to just deliver and deliver and deliver for 2 months straight during the summer. And one of my teachers, the poet and critic John Yao, said, well, you're bilingual, so why don't you at least translate? I think to sort of keep me productive. But what I realized that translation, also given my sort of the mother tongue, father tongue thing from earlier, it was also a process of grieving. And it was a way for me to mourn my father, but also a way for me to mourn the relationship more than anything. Language was not so much attached to his body or his passing, but to the relationship we had and had not had. And so I've come to think of translation more obviously as this auxiliary practice that runs parallel with and intersects with other literary and artistic practices. But I also do think of it as a process of mourning, and I think both in terms of mourning actual people, but I think more importantly in terms of my recent work, and this might be something that we're going to talk about later, but places, and also grieving and mourning language that has been lost, and sort of an inheritance of loss. So that was my first encounter with, I guess, what you would call more conventional literary translation. I translated, and this is interesting to me, I translated from Swedish to English. I was not comfortable translating in the other direction. And so I started translating poets whose work I envied. I translated poems I wish I'd written, and slowly started publishing those translations. That was in 2003, between 2003 and 2007. And then I stopped translating because I got sucked into academia, and I also quickly became aware that doing translation was not going to help me within the sort of academic structure. And so a few years later, in 2015, so I guess almost a decade later, I was asked to translate a book by an Iranian-Swedish poet, Atiana Farrokhzad. It was her debut, and it was a wildly popular book in Sweden, which sounds magical in a US context. for all of its problems, which I will talk about later, the two major publishing houses in Sweden publish poetry on a regular basis, and you can have a book of poetry that actually becomes part of a sort of literary vernacular. And White Blight, Vit Svit in original, was one of those books. And so I translated Athena, and it was my first encounter with having my own sort of personal and academic concerns link up with my work in translation. I had been thinking about and working in, at that point, for almost a decade in Asian American studies. And this translation project with White Blight was the first time that I was actually synthesizing my thinking around race and Asian American studies with my own experience growing up in these different contexts and being racialized in different ways through language. And this book, in many ways, was an opportunity for me to think those things together. And at that point, I realized that that I had work to do that felt meaningful to me in a different way. And so I started reading more work by Swedish poets of color. The literary landscape of Sweden at that point had shifted quite dramatically due to shifts in immigration policy, but also there was a generational shift. And so younger poets of color were an increasingly sort of multiracial group. Interestingly, to me at least, a lot of this work, and I don't want to essentialize it too much, but a lot of this work also engages with different kinds of formal experimentation that previously within Swedish poetry, which is very sort of, it's very bound by narrative and a kind of lyricism that doesn't stray too far from different conventions within the mainstream at least. But a lot of the work that I was reading was also sort of deploying language as an instrument against itself, and it was interesting to translate in terms of also the previous panel's discussion. In 2018, I moved back to Sweden. I'm obviously eliding a lot of information here, but I moved back to Sweden and started a PhD program in artistic research, where I actually had an academic framework to do this work that had previously been sort of accidental, which was bringing together Asian American studies and translation studies. The work that I'm doing there is three-pronged. I'm doing literary translations between Swedish and English, which I'll talk about in a sec. I'm engaging in different kind of writing around or through translation. And then I also developed a curriculum, or I developed a course in the kind of translingual translation that is the first course of its kind in Sweden. And so Swedish translation studies, or Swedish teaching of translation, which only takes place at the university level, the prerequisite is that you have an undergraduate degree already. So there's a very sort of profound self-selection that takes place in terms of who goes into the study of translation in Sweden. It's taught unidirectionally with the same languages. So you're always working from English into Swedish or from another language into Swedish. The emphasis is always on becoming a translator into Swedish for perhaps obvious reasons, which to me are not obvious. And I didn't know this. I assumed that studying translation in Sweden would look the way it did in the United States, again, because of my sort of imperial vantage point. But in fact, it was pretty rigid. And the program where I'm doing my PhD, they have a master's program in translation. And one of the first meetings that I had there was the head of the program saying to me, there's no ideology in translation, and you have to be very Swedish in order to be a good translator. And which to me was interesting. He's come around, but what's interesting to me is that he was definitely not the exception. And in some ways, Sweden is behind in a million different ways I'm so glad this isn't being live streamed. But one of the ways that I'm fascinated by the sort of the level of the conversation is that there is a kind of naivete around translation still that is stunning, but also means that I have a lot of material to work with. And so in terms of the translation work I'm doing, I look at the people around me in this room, nothing I'm doing is actually that radical. But if you move me to Sweden, if you take my little avatar and you put me in Sweden, what I'm doing is radical. And it's interesting to me because thinking about sort of linguistic equivalence makes no sense. But thinking about sort of situational shifts that you can enact if you translate otherwise in a different place is fascinating to me. And so that's what I've been trying to do. Whereas I was at one point engaging with more of a mode of transfer, these days it's very much about trying to sort of enact a kind of otherwiseness in a Swedish context. I started translating in different directions in a different direction when I moved to Sweden. So I became a translator from English to Swedish as well. I do that together with somebody else. And I translate Don Miche and Kim Hasun in particular. So I've also started doing indirect translations. My Swedish co-translator and we translate Don Mi's translations of Kim Hasun. So we work via the English, which obviously in some ways is a sort of political problem, but in other ways, working with a translator who's also a poet like Don Mi is, means that we're translating together in many ways. It's been interesting for me to also sort of become reacquainted with Swedish in this way. The last thing I just want to talk about very briefly is that these are my people in Sweden. I developed a curriculum sort of in response to this comment, you have to be very Swedish to be, or you have to be very Swedish to translate into Swedish, and there's no ideology. I wanted to create a course that was more accessible, that didn't have all these prerequisites attached to it. I wanted it to be a translingual course. I didn't want to reproduce a lot of the sort of inherent problems of the programs that I had studied in Sweden. That's not to say that I'm not reproducing other problems, but basically I've developed a course that's called To Translate. It's situated in a creative writing program outside Stockholm. The school itself is sort of like a community college. Sweden has a different sort of history and structure of education than the US does, obviously, but it's a school where there are no prerequisites. You can just apply, and there's no exam either. And so you're there, and it's a very sort of Freirean model. You do read texts, but the premise of the classroom is that everybody's sort of lived experience and knowledge is what constitutes the kind of text of the course. This is the English is the translation of the Swedish course description. I've taught the course for 2 years now. I'm teaching it again this fall. The first 2 years, it was clear that people sought the course out who really wanted to become literary translators. I've rewritten the course description so you can see in the second sentence that it's geared towards individuals with multilingual backgrounds, who have grown up between or across languages. It's a position that I feel is particularly politically urgent. Language has in Sweden become, it's a way to counteract a kind of profound rightward turn in politics, to sort of insist on a kind of presence of multilingualism in the country is to also insist on a kind of multiracialism. And so the course, hopefully this year, will also have this more sort of anti-racist component. We'll see. But all of these sort of different endeavors have, to me, been attempts to not settle into a kind of static multilingualism, but to open up for these sort of translingual, interlingual, polylingual places. And I don't know, I mean, I still have a year and a half left, and then I'm probably going to stay in Sweden indefinitely. So we'll see how it goes. But yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm very excited to be here. It's this will look right in a minute, but I want to start with the video as a way to get us into my what I'll be talking about from a both contextual but also affective perspective. This is a video that was produced by a group that I'll be talking about, Feminists for Gina in New York, and it's a group of Iranian diaspora feminists. Part of a transnational network of Feminists for Gina groups. And this video was produced and shown in Union Square on a wall where they put up, basically a huge canvas and showed it, and then was subsequently also presented at an event, both of which were on the one-year anniversary of the uprisings that began in September 2022 in Iran. So I think this is a good introduction, which is why I'm going to take it. It's about 5 minutes, and if this were a classroom, I'd give you a content warning about violence. So. It really doesn't like that.
برپاخیز برای زن زندگی آزادی 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 به نام زن به نام زندگی رها شویم ز طوق بندگی شب سیاه ما سحر شود تمام تا سیاره ها زبر شود که ما جوان ها صدا شویم من و تو و دگر دوباره ما شویم برپاخیز برای زن زندگی آزادی برپاخیز برای زن زندگی آزادی برپاخیز برای زن زندگی آزادی برپاخیز برای زن.
So I did not watch that because I actually can't watch it without crying. Um, so I don't know how everyone else is feeling. I'm very moved by that, even though I know other people's experiences, I'm sure, are different. Just want to take a moment. Okay. So today I want to reflect on the uprisings in Iran since September 2002 and my experience of them through the lens of a highly politicized group of Iranian diaspora feminists, which has led me to rethink my prior research approaches, sidestepping questions of translation. The impetus for my reflection come out of discussions at events organized by Feminists for Jina, New York, a group that, as I said, is part of a transnational network of diasporic Iranian feminists that came together in fall 2022 and is composed primarily of people who left the country as adults in the last 10 to 15 years. And I initially wasn't part of this group because when I had gone to the first meetings, they were all in Farsi, and my Farsi is like, okay, but I wasn't understanding everything, and I thought people would feel the need to translate for me. So I stepped out of the group and later was convinced to join it. So I'm currently a member of Feminists for Jina. But I also want to be clear that the comments I'm going to reference are not based on private conversations. They all come out of discussions that were held at public events that Feminists for Jina held. And so I'll be referencing comments that also are not from members of the group that were public speakers. So for context, in terms of how I come into this, my earlier work focused on the racialization of Muslims within liberalism, examining in part how US feminist and queer activist discourses function to move some Iranians across civilizational boundaries as objects of identification, only to reestablish Iran as a space of uniquely irrational and anti-modern violence. In my methods, I drew a border between spheres of discourse to avoid certain issues of translation. Not only did I work with English language sources, but I also avoided questions around Iranian diaspora politics, thinking only in terms of the reception and circulation of particular narratives and representations among broader US audiences. So for example, I looked at the reception of Azar Nafisi's memoir, reading Lolita in Tehran, looking at the reviews instead of looking at her. As an Iranian American who has lived and worked in the US for most of my life, my positionality defined my focus. In my analysis, I connected liberal discourses about Iran with those about Muslim Americans and other Muslim populations to show how Muslims were constructed as a population of risk that needed to be managed and intervened upon through surveillance, sanctions, and war. With increasing global media and activist entanglements, I find myself encountering discourses that are so intertwined between linguistic, cultural, and political spheres that it is impossible to draw lines and put ideas and images cleanly on one side or another. This became most obvious to me in September 2022 and the start of what some diaspora feminists would call the Jina Revolution, using the Kurdish names of Mahsa Amini. Her death at the hands of Iranian morality police due to her hijab catalyzed widespread and sustained acts of resistance across the country, led by young women. Opposition to compulsory hijab was immediately connected to other demands, with protests across urban and rural Iran, linking cultural, economic, and political grievances that in previous protests had been separated. This notion of an inclusive feminist revolution was encapsulated in the primary slogan of the protests, Woman, Life, Freedom, chanted usually in Farsi as Zan Zindagi Azadi, which you just heard, but originating in the Kurdish slogan Jin Jian Azadi. The opening lines of a March 8 Feminist for Jina statement captures much of this statement, and this was written by the global group in Farsi and then translated into English, so I'll read the English. The Jina Revolution is life itself that blooms on the fabric of decay and ruin, an uproar at the intersection of gender discrimination, economic and ethnic discrimination, and irreversible rupture, the transformation of the voice of protest for change to change itself. This is about the collapse of the ruling regime's authority in our minds before their total collapse in reality. Nothing is like it was before, even our image of the revolution. This feeling of the fundamental and transformative effects of these uprisings was produced for many in diaspora through the widespread circulation of truly awe-inspiring images and videos from Iranian streets, alongside mass mobilizations of Iranians in diaspora in cities across the globe. It indeed looked and felt like nothing we had seen before. At a one-year anniversary event of the uprisings in New York, diaspora feminists talked about feeling completely enmeshed and personally transformed by their daily affective connections to the protests via their social media feeds and other sources of information. This experience in turn validated their feeling that they ought to speak out on Iran from their diaspora positions. As Bahar Badi, an activist and PhD candidate, said, I started reclaiming my relationship with people back home, and I felt after a long time that I can give myself the right to talk about what is happening inside Iran without actually physically living in Iran. I would give myself the permission because Jina was about me. Jina was about all marginalized bodies in Iran and beyond Iran, and it was inherently intersectional from the beginning. The borders of inside, outside, who has the right, who has the authenticity, who has the authority to speak about the revolution, started collapsing. The boundaries are blurrier now. Although at this point the protests had been suppressed, and that's how the video ends. It tells you about what the current situation is, including the arrests, killings, executions, etc. The speakers still felt that the revolutionary transformation of Iranian consciousness remained and was enacted in everyday resistance. As a first ever feminist movement of its kind globally, this is their perspective, they also thought that the Jina Revolution should serve as inspiration to others across the world and actively sought to create linkages between struggles. Nevertheless, I also often heard comments of frustration as these feminists moving within academic and leftist circles encountered suspicion and misreading of their politics. On one hand, a predominant strain of anti-imperialist leftist politics has long challenged activists bringing attention to repression and autocracy in Iran, which is seen as only playing into the hands of US imperialism. Consistent with this dynamic was a feeling many expressed of a lack of support among leftist feminists. One element here is a presumed hierarchy between feminist and national sovereignty claims that undergirds an anti-imperialist dismissal of such movements. In her examination of online discourses on Iranian feminist protests in the 2010s, Sara Tafakkuri notes that feminism and opposition to US sanctions in Iran were often presented as mutually exclusive. Rarely, she says, are race, coloniality, and gender framed as problems that require addressing simultaneously. This incompatibility of recognition claims is central to the transnational operation of both Western and localist discourses. On the other hand, diaspora feminist activists also feared co-optation of the movement by feminists and conservatives towards anti-Muslim politics that they found anathema. Indeed, their politics came up against multiple binaries which framed the uprisings in ways that detracted from their power and purpose. And here I turn to two interconnected discursive constructions that I believe delimited the field of legibility for Iranian diaspora feminists. The first is a problem of calling the uprisings the hijab or anti-hijab protests, as was common in the US media. And the second is the problematic binary reading of Masih Alinejad as either a spokesperson for the movement or as a native informant. If we don't have time for the second one, David, you'll cut me off, but I can skip that one. But there's a kind of parallel dynamic there that's, I think, also important. So the hijab protest. How should we understand protests that centered women's acts of removing, waving, and burning headscarves? The most powerful imagery coming out of these protests were, in another reading, also the most problematic, in that they seemed to align with facile understandings of the liberation of Muslim women. The narrative that seemed to emerge was that after 4 decades of theocratic repression, Iranian women had finally woken up and thrown off their hijabs. Indeed, cliched understandings of the veil in Orientalist and feminist discourses on Muslim women can overwhelm other interpretations. Kiana Karimi, commenting at the 1-year anniversary event, called this issue the elephant in the room, noting, "We are in the location of the empire. This empire has a history of using and abusing feminism as a way to support interventionist policies, as the way to prop up wars, and one of the objects that has been used to justify those interventions has been hijab." With that in the background, we as feminists in the US want to support people who want to choose hijab as a way of clothing. And of course, we want to complicate this idea of what hijab is, because it means different things to different people. As Karimi is referencing, this hegemonic notion, the Orientalist one, has produced a counter-discourse. However, the counter-discourse often takes a shallow form of presenting the hijab as a marker of Muslim identity, any challenge to which is deemed inherently Islamophobic. This is a perception I've encountered in my classrooms, and one that fails to consider that the meaning of all clothing and the degree of choice or coercion experienced in donning it is highly contextual. Karimi advocates a simple and clear third pathway, a recognition that the issue is one of choice and bodily autonomy. That said, we still are faced with the question of why these protests now. Although Iranian women came out in opposition to compulsory hijab when it was first instituted in 1979, over the last several decades, it has not been a central feminist cause, even as many women's daily practices and how they wore the hijab or interacted with morality police involved resistance. And also, even though there has been important feminist activism, that should not be forgotten. By way of example, the hijab was not a focus of the 1 million signatures campaign for the repeal of discriminatory laws, which started in 2006, and was a multi-sided grassroots feminist movement that educated the public and garnered support for the repeal of gender discriminatory laws, primarily in the realm of family law, positioning their demands as consistent with Islam and with the high social status of women in Iran, who made up the majority of university students. They, like many others of the period, took a reformist approach. However, as hope for possibility of lasting achievements within the Islamic Republic gave way to broad-based support for its ouster and the common chant of death to the dictator, compulsory hijab emerged as the epitome of the Islamic Republic's patriarchy, corruption, and authoritarianism, and a ready site of resistance to state power. Hence, while women do want the choice to wear the hijab or not, the removal of the hijab in this context also carries many more meanings. Indeed, protesters were clear that the uprisings were both about much more than the hijab and not against the hijab per se. One genre of circulating images showed a pair of female friends in public places where a hijab-wearing woman is braiding her friend's long and uncovered locks. These images of simple everyday activity articulated both respect for individual autonomy and collective solidarity and care, perhaps a better encapsulation of what the protests were about. And if there's time for me to talk about Masih Alinejad. Okay, thank you. So now I'm going to turn to the dual representations of Masih Alinejad, a journalist who left Iran in 2009 and has gained much recognition for her online campaigns against compulsory hijab since 2013, through which Iranian women shared images and videos of themselves without hijab in public places. And one of her campaigns was called My Stealthy Freedom. She also has written a book, The Wind in My Hair. So the mainstream perspective of Alinejad is that she is an inspiration and spokesperson for the movement as a whole. For example, as reflected in a New Yorker profile of her a few weeks into the uprising that titled The Exiled Dissident Fueling the Hijab Protests in Iran. And she was also named a Time Magazine Woman of the Year. On the other hand, Alinejad has been broadly dismissed by critics, especially Iranians, who have pointed out her meetings with powerful members of US and other governments, for example, Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State to Donald Trump, or Emmanuel Macron. Her association with conservative think tanks, the fact that she works for a US-funded news agency, The Voice of America, and that she has supported interventionist approaches to Iran. So to be clear, I agree that Alinejad warrants critique for her extensive policy advocacy work, which, if successful, would be incredibly harmful to Iranian people. However, I worry about the wholesale dismissal of her project only because it implicates many other Iranian women, including those to whom she has given a forum, as dupes to the US empire. In their analysis of the Iranian Me Too movement, Mincheva and Human note that the accounts of women like Alinejad, who have been deemed native informants by some, are, quote, not in fact different from what many women who live, work, and write inside Iran share in Farsi for various Iranian outlets. Women who, quote, do perceive their life worlds as profoundly informed by the Islamic and legal praxis of the Iranian state, rather than by forces like US sanctions. This suggests that a broad brush dismissal of Alinejad can serve to legitimize Iranian women's critiques, can serve to delegitimize Iranian women's critiques of the Islamic Republic. My question is, how can a space be created for these women to articulate their own experiences and understandings without always having to center a critique of US imperialism, a distant factor from their perspectives? The problem with Alinejad's accounts of women's lives in Iran is not that they are untrue, but how they are understood and mobilized in the US context. Indeed, this is a problem of translation as I understand it, but the question of how to convey meanings across borders is not one that is easily resolved. Mincheva and Human advocate a feminism on the border that refuses binary explanations and is rooted in an ethic of care that accepts women's own understandings of their experiences. This would require the construction of a field of legibility for Iranian feminists, one that can only emerge where there is a sense of shared purpose and commitment, and openness to having one's own frameworks of analysis disturbed. Thank you.
And thank you, Natalie.
Hi, everyone. In the 1990s, I started a journey with translation and what I call literary activism. I really didn't know what I was getting into at the time, but I was in Paris, and I would go to a lot of the events at the Institut du Monde Arabe, which is the Arab World Institute, and I encountered a lot of women, Arab women writers, women poets in particular, and none of their works had been translated into English. One of the pioneers, Salma Kadrajayusi, who was a founder and director of PROTA, which is the Project of Translation from Arabic, really a groundbreaking space at the time for translation of Arabic literature into English. She was a mentor, and I was very much inspired by her as, you know, a young writer myself and someone who grew up in 4 continents, so I had a lot of different languages, and particularly interested, of course, in the Mediterranean region, Asia and the Middle East. So I started collecting works by Arab women poets. Now, at the time, we didn't have social media, so it was really quite an adventure to get these works, try to collect these books. So, for instance, you know, getting books from, in the three regions, if we're looking at the three regions, North Africa, the Levant, and the Gulf, just doing the research itself. And then getting to what was extremely important for me was that I wanted to bring all these women writing in all these different languages in one space, because we had not experienced these women in that way. And to speak also of the sociopolitical context that exists, of course, and that led to their works in every single region. So we would say, you know, to use this word, the Arab world or the Middle East, but what did that look like and what was that like? So I had 82 Arab women in this book, with a very long introduction that spoke from, you know, it spoke about the feminist movements in the region, as well as just the particularities of every country. As we know, this is a region that has, you know, conflicts that, especially in the Levant, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, so a lot of things keep shifting. So the book came out in 2001, and of course, we also had 9/11. So this was, and everything was shifting at that time. And I can still recall just putting together, getting the permission slips, for example, for the book, for the Poetry of Arab Women. It was, you know, just thinking back how things change overnight. I remember one story of a poet in Tunisia where I asked her, you know, we had to have all these permission slips, and she drove 3 hours into the countryside to get a permission from one of the poets and would fax it back to me. So it was kind of that sort of community, okay? And then overnight, you know, we had 9/11, and then things kind of just shifted. And that's also what led me to meet Jen at the time, because I was also working with theater. That's when Arab American theater groups started, all the different groups, Asian American groups, Middle Eastern, etc. So this work informed me in so many different ways. And of course, at the heart of it is translation, right? The linguistic translation, the socio-political translations, the cultural translations. The word Arab itself, what does it mean to be an Arab? And also how these has transformed within an American context. So, for example, at the moment when we speak about Asia, okay, of course, the Levant is part of West Asia, and how, you know, there's been so many different shifts, and those shifts have happened in the last 20 years in a really, 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 really fast, you know? So because of 9/11, me and two other editors, we engaged in another project called, that led to a book that Norton translated. It's called Language for a New Century, Poetry from Southeast Asia, East Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East. 450 poets, 61 countries, 40 different languages. This took almost a decade. Just to link it back to Mitra and Jennifer, at the time, one of the things, for example, Central Asia was really important. We never, we don't, now it's starting to, we are starting to get literature coming from there, but for us it was really important to include them, but there weren't translators. Now some of the, for example, take Uzbekistan, some of, I'd met some, during research, I'd met some of them in London working for the BBC, and they told me of a group of Uzbeks who had gone to Sweden. So here we were with this dilemma. What do we do if we can't translate directly from Uzbek? We have to go through Swedish, etc. You know, that brought up many different questions, right? And then to link it to Mitra, we had women who really put their life at risk just to publish one poem. So what does it mean to write? What does it mean to engage in this act, okay? And then one of my favorite stories was in the permission, because you learn a lot gathering these permission slips, was when we sent one of the Afghan poets we were working with who helped us a lot in the whole region. We sent him a note, an email, and said, please sign this form. So he wrote back an email and he said, you have my permission. And we sent him the note again. I go, yes, but please sign the form. So he wrote back, in the name of Allah, I give you permission. So we sent it to Nort and we said, the guy said, in the name of Allah, in the name of God, so we're not. And there was this thing on, he was trying to communicate, do you not trust me? There was this whole conversation that opened up from this moment. And of course, from that point, when we look at when I started in the 90s until now, I mean, the landscape is so different at all levels. There's been more wars, there's been more migrations, and now we have a whole generation of people, for example, that came from Iraq, Palestine, just all over, that are new generations writing in Swedish, writing in Icelandic and Finnish. I mean, a whole body of people from that region writing in different languages other than English, right? When we're speaking here about English, and how then now they're being translated into English and also back into Arabic, and what does that mean, right? And then we have new magazines. I've worked for almost 2 decades now with Words Without Borders. I have a column called The City and the Writer, which interviews writers about their cities. How does cityscapes create imaginative scapes? Because obviously in this conversation, urban spaces are really important. And also publishers. For example, Yale has, their series of literature and translation. And then in relationship to the Arab world, we have the Gulf. Now, the Gulf, we both are in Abu Dhabi, is, 50 years old, right? This, when I was doing the Poetry of Arab Women, really, this world didn't exist. By that, I mean, obviously, the region existed. We have Bedouin culture and so forth. But what we have today, where there is so much, as David can attest, I mean, so much is happening from the visual arts to the literary arts in that region, okay? That this didn't exist. And it really happened in the last 20 years. And being at NYU there, it's grown so much in the decade that we've been there. So this is a really important, this space in the Gulf is really important in relationship to the Middle East. So now to shift a little bit back to, on a more personal note, Jennifer spoke about, her family and how she came into language. For me, of course, coming from the Mediterranean, I always say, it's a region fostered by the movement of peoples and commodities, the transmission of culture and ideas, stimulating minds and inspiring adventures. The Mediterranean people are navigators and interpreters. Our lingua franca is the sea, a language born in the waves and ports. And there are many tongues. And of course, this is where I find myself in those crossroads. But how do I explain that to the world? Because I was, I have different fluencies in 9 different languages. And as a writer myself, how did I become a writer without a mother tongue? And I've translated all my life, and for me, translation is a viaduct, a trade route of minds, linking ideas, cultures, worlds, and creating new languages and masterpieces. Without it, we would be isolated in the territory of our minds, culture, and country. But Eugene this morning, really, I thought so much about, what you were saying. And language to me has always been a ruin that I keep excavating. And it is impossible to forget the history associated to a language, personal and historical, because no language is untouched. They all carry the remains of other civilizations and conquests. And it's in these connections that I'm also reminded of a global gathering, because we tend to think about divisions, but I'm very much interested in connections. So what languages did I what language did I have to write in? I didn't know. And I mean, the languages I was closest to, French, Spanish, Arabic, and English, which dialect was I closest to? Which accent did I inhabit more easily? Which literary space would I belong to? My French is a mélange of Parisian, French, Caribbean, Swedish, and the south of France, le Midi. My Spanish is infused with the cultures of Madrid, Andalusia, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic. My Arabic is a Levantine blend steeped in Bethlehemite colloquialism. And my English is infused by the American, British, and international English schools, which has its own linguistic culture. And then, of course, there's the other languages. And for me, these languages that came together were really, I call my native language a symphony. And the reason why I call this a symphony is because I felt very fluent in all the cultures of these languages. Like, I spoke these cultures fluently, but I didn't speak the language necessarily fluently. So what do I do with that as a writer? And I love what Eugene said earlier on, which is that even if you could be writing something, and I love the American English. For me, that was a great space, because I always felt the American English had what I call flexible muscles. And by that I meant that the culture itself accommodated the other cultures, of which I couldn't do, for example, in French or in the other languages, because, I mean, even one French mistake, you would, the teacher would punish you, or we'd have to repeat the lesson all over again. So the American English, of course, was a space that was really free for me. And then, of course, being in New York City allowed me to see myself and to understand myself. It really was a rebirth for me, and especially living in Queens. So that really informed me of who I was in the world, that really being in that space where I can see all my shadows, all my echoes, and who I was in the world. Also, though, I want to mention that in all these different languages, which were English, Arabic, French, Spanish, Italian, Creole, Greek, Portuguese, Armenian, and Russian, and every sentence is a reminder of being inside and outside. Sometimes there's a border between what I hear in my mind and can verbalize, what I write and can recite. These have traumatized and transformed me. It made me understand that nothing can be neutral, that everything is political, language and love and self, and that literature is on the side of truth. So I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just end. I'm a poet, so I thought I'd end with a poem that sort of speaks to what I've just said, and also speak to this idea of what is the alphabet in my body. So this poem is called Blue Hours. In the blue hour, the negrita cries, I hide not to deceive the darkness or myself. La negrita is not far from where I stand, her eyebrows, her one hand. I too am visible now, behind the tree, behind the night, behind the cry, and all I want to know is her name and ask her. Have you ever heard your heart undressing? Seen a stray dog at midnight, realize he understands this hour better than you will understand any hour? Have you ever seen yourself in every woman with your eyes, or in women with eyes more difficult than yours? Have you ever really heard your voice echoing? She offers me tea. We end up drinking coffee, trying to reach the bottom of the cup, unafraid. Now, my French is stained, my English failing me, my Arabic fading, my Greek awakening, my Italian waiting, my Spanish starting to make sense. We are in a finca now. Perhaps we are safe. Perhaps we desire nothing else, but I can't stop bowing in prayer 5 times a day. My country comes to me, tells me, compatriota, I will always find you, no matter what language you are speaking. Thank you.
you as well. Thank you. But we have 15 minutes, I think, for questions for our panelists. In and among the panelists, if that arises. But I'd like to hear what's on everyone's mind.
I like to be the first person asking questions.
Please,
obviously.
please.
So I've been I spent 15 years teaching in Asian American studies, and one of the things that fascinates me is that translation is not a part of how we think about Asian American studies and ethnic studies more broadly. It's either taken for granted, but it's not actually explored. And I'd love to hear more about your thinking around whether or not you belonged in this group or whether or not you should work with them, depending on your level of Farsi. And it's sort of a personal question, but to me, it's also a methodological question. And so would you mind speaking about that a little bit?
Sure, sure. I mean,
Thanks.
I have to say, even writing this, I debated if I had,
The right.
the right to say anything. I mean, the quote that I have from Bahare is also kind of, I think it's something that many people feel, even, but language makes it more intense, right? When you feel that, you're, so when I initially went to a meeting, people were speaking mostly Farsi, and there were a couple of us there who were not, basically we said, you speak Farsi, it's fine, but we might not understand everything, and we'll speak English. So, and everyone spoke English. So, and that was okay, but then people would start to be very aware of us not understanding certain things, and then they would switch, and then there was somebody who was taking notes in English so that the people who were, so it became a kind of almost too cumbersome, and then I thought, well, this is a group of mostly, native Farsi speakers who are more comfortable in Farsi. Let them do their thing, right? Like, why should I insert myself? So, but then at some point, I kind of checked in with a friend who Farsi is just a little better than mine, and she said, no, it's, she checked in with others, and the last meeting I was at, it's funny because some meetings are all in English, and I don't know why, and then some meetings are all in Farsi, and then some meetings...
Does it have to do with the topic, or...?
Well, last meeting, suddenly everyone was speaking only Farsi, and then it came my turn to talk, and I said, well, I think I understand well, first of all, let me check what we're talking about, because everyone's talking a lot, but sometimes the topic itself was unclear, right? And I said, okay, I think we're talking about what we're going to do. And then I said, I understood about 70%. So this is, and then this is how I'm going to contribute. And it's, but that's also actually how I feel about my research. So it's all very connected that, is it, at what point can I say something, right? And then what can I say something about? How do I draw the boundaries around what I'm talking about? And before I was very clear, I wasn't talking about Iranians. I was only talking about representations thereof. And now I feel like it's really hard to only talk about representations thereof. I have to talk also about Iranians in some sense.
Thank you.
I have a question also from Mitra, but I'm sorry, it's very trite and obvious, and I'm sure you've been asked that 50,000 times. But the uprising of 22 is sure to repeat soon enough, right?
Well, maybe.
Or
I don't know.
likely.
Yeah.
And the question is, what do you think outsiders should do in the situation where any appearance of outsider aid internally compromises the recipients of the aid? And I mean, in this case, the question is Iran, but it also applies to Belarus, to Russia, to lots and lots of places.
I mean, there's no easy answer, but and certainly you talk to Iranians, they'll tell you many different things that are things that I would never say. So there's no unified answer to that question. But my perspective, and before this group, I was part of this other group called Raha, Iranian Feminist Collective, that formed around solidarity with the 2009 Green Movement. And our tag was basically liberation comes from below. And so this idea that we want to try to understand how transnational solidarity can happen through non-state, basically grassroots and linkages, and that it's about understanding your own struggle and then connecting the struggles through that understanding of what you bring to your own struggle, what you could learn from each other. And so that's the perspective. That's not an answer to that question though. But I do think that that the idea that we need to not interact with something is also really harmful, and that's a perspective a lot of people have taken from work like mine that critiques, so that's what I'm trying to counter. So yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I wonder if I could return to a concept that's come up, I think, in all three of our panelists' discussion, and that's the idea of the mother tongue, which only recently from Jennifer I learned of Yesenia Yıldız's book, yes, Beyond the Mother Tongue. And I suppose there's different genealogies. It's a widely available phrase. But Yıldız ties it specifically to German Enlightenment, yes, to Schleiermacher, and then it's actually Richard Wagner who puts the point most forcefully, yes.
Among others. I mean, she writes about Tawada as well. And I mean, this idea of the mother tongue being a way to consolidate language in service of various nation-state apparatuses, apparati. I mean, what she's really, it's Beyond the Mother Tongue. I mean, it's a great book, but it's, I mean, what she's interested in, I think, my interpretation, which I'm also interested in, is this idea of the monolingual paradigm, this assumption that that there is like an uncontaminated language, which is also why I'm so interested in translingualism. Is, I mean, to me, language is inherently contaminated, and the foreign in a language is already there. It's just how you choose to sort of read it. And so it's translation. Yeah, sorry, I sort of hijacked your.
Not at all, not at all. It was a necessary. And Natalie, we heard you said that you lack one. Is that right?
Yeah.
Would that be accurate?
Yeah. No, I was just going to say that before that, can I just make a comment? Makes me think about what you said about the not Swedish enough and this idea of
Right.
authentic, and it draws on that. How then do we speak about that, in beyond the mother tongue to what's authentic or what's not authentic, right? Yeah, I don't have a mother tongue, but I have a mother tongue. Like, by that I mean it's a symphony, right? And anyways, as poets and as writers, we're always trying to create a language, right? In a way. So that's how I've come to live with it, right? And I mean, I was talking to Monica earlier. I don't know how, when we speak about fluency, what does that also mean? I think it's a very interesting question to ask each one of us to ask. Like, are we fluent really in a language? What does fluency actually mean when we say we are fluent in a language?
So a lot of in the slide that I was showing of the different books of poetry that I've translated, and you mentioned this as well, Natalie, the poets who I work with now are generally 1.5 or second generation Swedes. So they've come from Turkey, Iran, former Yugoslavia, among other places. And so they're writing in their 1.5 or second language, which also means that I'm translating them into a kind of English that is also what Spivak and Donmi would call frayed. And so that, in some ways, the sort of deficits that I have in relation to both my languages, because I am fluent, but to me, fluency, going back to your question, also has to do with knowing how to pass as fluent. When I moved back to Sweden, I spoke Swedish as a teenager, like the way a teenager in the 80s would have spoken Swedish. And so I had to become fluent in academic Swedish as well. And so in some ways, translation has been a way for me to remind myself that all of the sort of tears or not knowing in both languages are useful in relation to the people whose work I translate, who also have a certain degree of sort of, I don't want to say brokenness, but I mean a kind of productive, a poetically productive brokenness, not in the negative sense, in their poetics. And I think in some ways, I think the way the displacement of people works is that it also means that people have a multitude of tongues, and depending on what sort of state apparatus they go into, they can sort of strategically use a tongue that needs to be used. But I think the way the state works, and this is just based on my experiences teaching in Sweden and in the US, is it's always portrayed as a deficit. And I think one of the great things about translation is that you can see that it's actually a resource, that having these different relationships to language that aren't necessarily always about fluency is a kind of translational poetics, this like not always feeling completely at home in a language. So.
And yet they carry like these first and a half, or they probably carry a lot of that language in the Swedish, even if they're themselves not fluent in it. But the cultures there, like some expression, some music within that that filters through. So
Yeah, there's a poet I'm reading from former Yugoslavia, or who I'm translating right now, and she and I talk a lot about how her syntax, but also the idiomatic is sort of, it's always kind of playing a trick on the Swedish, and she has forgotten, and so then my questions will sort of prompt her to remember, oh, that's an idiomatic expression that I've brought with me. So, but it makes her poetry wild.
yeah,
In the best
it's
possible
great for
way.
it's great for poetry.
It's
Yeah.
very hard if you're a prose writer.
Jen, Skabitane.
Yeah, I'm always trying to, when my students say, well, I don't really speak Korean, I speak kitchen Korean or something, I'm always trying to transmute that into, no, it's not a deficit, it's a superpower, you know? But my question, I really appreciated the conversation, was really for Natalie, since I've been working on this, you know, issue of the nation state as an ideal and as a dystopia. I just had a question about the country that you invoke and call out at the end of the poem, and I just wonder, is that a real place? You know, is there any country or state, you know, that can accommodate all of these tongues? So it's actually a very simple question, but I just was genuinely curious.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I today, if you ask me, I say I'm a New Yorker of Mediterranean roots. You know, this is what I feel. But what is the Mediterranean, right? I mean, we're talking from Africa to Europe, from up in, I mean, it's everything, right? It's Asia, it's everything. It's the sea, it's the Mediterranean Sea. It trades, it translates, it's all encompassing in that way. So I think there's that. And though there is a place, which is, there's also a place, apart from that, there's also a place which is Bethlehem. That's where my father's family, they're from Bethlehem. And again, it's of course a place where there is a lot of conflict, but Bethlehem in itself occupies a really important, I mean, we're in Italy, right? There's a church, or many churches on every block, and there's the nativity, and there's all this, you know, linked to the Christian world, and yet it's not really a place. It's a place and not a, I mean, today, in the conflict and so forth. So it also draws on that. But if we think back on what it was, right, it was a place of plurality, just like the rest. And that's what I want to remember, because that's what it is. That's the true nature of things. And go back to this idea of politics. So it's to go back to, in fact, and my interest in connections, not in a naive way, as some have told me, but in this idea that fragments can be whole. You know, they're not broken, but there's a wholeness to it.
It's 4 o'clock. And by the posted schedule, we'll be enjoying coffee.
Yeah.
And continuing the conversation. But join us again at 4:30 for Monica de la Torre's keynote speech.
Thank you, David.
You better not.